Hi everyone, this is Dr. Kibet. I want to welcome you to my class, and the topic of my class today is experimental research. I want us to look at this. The first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what is experimental research? Experimental research is research conducted with a scientific approach using two sets of variables. The first set acts as a constant, which you use to measure the differences of the second set. Experimental research is a scientific approach to research where one or more independent variables are manipulated and applied to one or more dependent variables to measure their effect on the latter. The effect of the independent variables on the independent variable is usually observed and recorded over some time to aid researchers in drawing a reasonable conclusion regarding the relationship between these two variable types. It can also be said to be a method which is widely used in physical and social sciences, psychology, and education. It includes an hypothesis, a variable that can be manipulated by the researcher, and variables that can be measured, calculated, and compared. Experimental research can also be said to be completed in a controlled X environment. What is the purpose of experimental research? Experimental research seeks to determine a relationship between two variables, the dependent variable and the independent variable. After completing an experimental research study, a correlation between a specific aspect of an entity and the variable being studied is either supported or rejected. Types of experiments considered experimental research projects. 1. Forensic studies, starting splatter, in bracket, a physics or stroke math study, decomposition and entomology study, damage to objects, in brackets, a physics stroke engineering study, can be done in a controlled environment and be measured. Number 2, the effect on studies. All experimental studies look to determine how one thing affects another. Number 3, product effectiveness. If a specific aspect, in brackets, active ingredients, size of crucial components, etc., of several products can be determined to be different quality or quantity, this makes for a great experimental project. For example, the different levels of ethyl alcohol within antibacterial hand sanitizers. Number 4, the last one, microbiology. Bacteria, in brackets, and some protists grow quickly. Changing population is easily measured and therefore make for a good experimental study. Now, let's look at the characteristics of experimental study. 1, it includes an hypothesis, a variable that will be manipulated by the researcher along with the variable that will be measured and compared. The data in this research must be able to be quantified. 3, the observation of the subjects, however, must be executed qualitatively. Number 4, it can be conducted in a laboratory in field settings, that is to say, field research. Number 5, it relies on making comparison between two or more groups, that is the variables. Number 6, some variables are given an experimental stimulus called a treatment. This is the treatment group. Number 7, the variable that do not receive a stimulus are known as the control group. 8, first, researchers must consider how the variables are related, and only afterwards can they move on to make predictions that can be tested. And lastly, number 9, time is a crucial component when putting forth a cause and effect relationship. Let's look at the components of experimental study. An experiment has the following components. As we've just seen, hypothesis, independent variable, dependent variable, and experimental controls. In an experimental study, the participants are carefully selected and matched to a number of variables that could potentially affect the results. For example, gender, age, school experience, etc. Hypothesis. Research in developmental psychology begins by formulating an hypothesis, which is an educated informed guess or a positive explanation for a behavior being studied. A hypothesis is expressed as a prediction or as a statement of cause and effect. A scientific hypothesis is based on facts and theories that have been gathered and investigated by previous researchers or observation by the researcher. It is poised in a way that indicates how the results can be measured. It may or may not correct since it may or may not be correct since it is a possible explanation for behavior, and it is subject to verification or proof through a scientific study. Types of hypotheses. We have two types of hypotheses. The first one is the alternative hypothesis, which is positively stated. For example, there is a relationship between diet and the rate of child development. That is an alternative hypothesis, which is stated positively. The other one is the null hypothesis or the zero hypothesis, which is negatively stated. For example, there is no relationship between motivation and academic achievement, or there is no relationship between the mother's diet and the birth weight of a newborn baby. Variables. A variable is a factor that may vary or change. It can assume more than one value. For example, factors such as weight, height, scores, or a test, motivation, and so on. An independent variable is a factor that is selected and manipulated by the experimenter and is independent of anything the subject does. The experimenter can vary it as if he or she thinks is necessary in terms of what he wants to achieve. Dependent variable. It refers to a measurable behavior or outcome exhibited by the subject and is affected by the independent variable. In other words, its value is dependent on the independent variable. Extraneous variable. Extraneous variable is a factor that may influence the results if it is not adequately controlled. Extraneous variable get it in the way of the study and make it look as though we found what we expected even though we did not. Therefore, they confound or confuse the results. In an experimental research study, we also talk about experimental controls and non-group or non-treatment group. So what is experimental controls? In an experiment, the researcher randomly assigns subjects to experimental and control groups. The experimental group receives treatment with the aim of discovering whether the treatment has predictable effect on some outcome or behavior. That is the dependent variable. On the other hand, we have the control group or the non-treatment group. This group does not receive such treatment so as to ensure that any changes in the dependent variable are due to the treatment administered. The two groups are expected to have similar attributes or characteristics. The effect of the treatment is assessed by comparing the two groups after treatment is given to the experimental group. So thank you very much. That marks the end of my class, which we have been looking at the experimental research. We were also able to look at the purpose of experimental research. We also looked at the types of experiments considered as experimental research projects. We were also able to look at the characteristics of experimental research, and we were also able to define the following: an hypothesis, variables, and finally, we were also able to look at the experimental controls and the control group. Thank you, and bye-bye.